Zionism, the political movement that led to the founding of the modern state of Israel, and one that sustains its survival to this day, has always been more than a national project. It self-admittingly has labeled the movement as a settler colonial project. From its early days, it has strategically depended on three major forces, or what we might call the trinity of success: the God of faith, a theological claim; the God of force, the imperial patron; and the God of power, the political, economic influence. These forces of belief, empire, and influence have played vital roles in shaping and sustaining Zionism from the late 19th century onwards, and have allowed it great range in immorality and deceit, both in words and actions, all in the cause of achieving its goals at the expense of a simpler and weaker nation of people. When Zionism emerged in the late 19th century, it wasn't born in synagogues or religious texts. It was born in the cafes, congresses, and corridors of European secular thought. Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist and the founder of modern political Zionism, was a secular Jew. He envisioned Zionism not as a divine mission, but as a pragmatic solution to rising anti-Semitism in Europe. To Herzl and many early Zionist thinkers, the movement was about national self-determination. It was a European-style nationalism, a way to normalize a concocted Jewish unified people's existence through the creation of a state, just like the French, Germans, or Italians had done. But there was a slight problem. Most Jews at the time were either religiously observant or skeptical of Zionism altogether. Many Orthodox communities rejected Zionism outright, as heretical. Assimilated Jews in Western Europe often saw Zionism as a retreat or regression from modern life, not a solution. Early Zionist leaders began to realize that political ideology and arguments alone wouldn't be enough. If they wanted to unite Jews across diverse backgrounds, religious, secular, Eastern, and Western, they needed something deeper, something emotional, something sacred. Enter the God of faith. And so the movement adopted a powerful tool: the narrative of divine selection. The biblical idea that Jews were the chosen people, and that the land of Israel was their God-given inheritance, became central to Zionist messaging. Even for secular leaders, this mythology offered a symbolic glue, a unifying story that transcended politics and history. It wasn't about their own personal beliefs any longer, it was about mobilizing the masses. These Zionist leaders weren't necessarily religious, but they understood the power of religion. By framing the project as a return to a sacred homeland, they gave Zionism moral legitimacy and emotional weight. This theological turn wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Religious language turned skeptical Jews into passionate supporters. It made the dream of return feel ancient, inevitable, and holy. Not just a political campaign, but a fulfillment of a destiny. And still to this day, the God of faith remains a central pillar of Zionism's self-image. The language of chosenness, divine destiny, and biblical entitlement continues to be invoked by Israeli leaders, settlers, and religious Zionists alike, not just as spiritual rhetoric, but as justification for statehood, expansion, and resistance to external pressure. Even in secular, supposedly democratic institutions, the sacred narrative lends Israel a sense of historical and moral legitimacy that few other nation-states claim so explicitly. From its very beginnings, Zionism was not only peddled as a project of spiritual destiny or national revival, it was also a project of strategic dependency. The leaders of the Zionist movement understood a hard truth: a stateless people could not claim a land already inhabited without the backing of global power. They needed not just legitimacy, but leverage, military, political, and diplomatic. That power first came in the form with the British Empire, the most dominant imperial force in the Middle East during the early 20th century. The British, eyeing strategic control over Greater Syria, Egypt and the Suez Canal, as well as Iraq, were eager for loyal allies on the ground. The Zionists, eager for a foothold, presented themselves as exactly that. One of the most unfiltered acknowledgments of this reality came from Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the father of revisionist Zionism. Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population. This colonization can therefore continue and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach. Jabotinsky wasn't being cynical here. He was being brutally honest. Zionism required an empire, not just to protect Jews, but to impose a new reality on a resistant population. Over the next 3 decades, Zionist leaders worked with, and at times around, the British administration to lay the foundations for a Jewish state. Immigration, land purchases, and military training were all made possible under the umbrella of British imperial protection. When Arab resistance erupted, it was often British soldiers who suppressed it. But empire is never permanent. After World War II, Great Britain was weakened. The global order was shifting and a new superpower was rising, the United States. And just as they had done with the British, Zionist leaders turned their attention westward, cultivating American allies, lobbying their Congress, and rebranding the movement as aligned with Western democratic values during the height of the Cold War. In 1948, when Israel declared independence, it did so knowing that it had American sympathy and soon American weapons. From then on, the United States would become Zionism's most important imperial patron, supplying military aid, vetoing UN resolutions, and backing Israel in every major war. I had faith in Israel before it was established. I have faith in it now. I believe it has a glorious future before it, not just as another sovereign nation, but as an embodiment of the great ideals of our civilization. But this wasn't just support. It became dependence. Israel's survival, particularly in its early decades, was deeply tied to American money, weapons, and diplomacy. US support enabled not just defense, but expansion. It allowed Israel to occupy, settle, and reshape territory in ways that would have been impossible without the assurance of American protection. Zionism without empire is like a sail without wind. Whether it was the British then or the Americans now, the movement had always required a global patron to function and to win. Even today, US military aid to Israel is unrelenting, while diplomatic support remains ironclad, even in the face of international condemnation of settlement expansion or military actions in Gaza. This patronage has insulated Israel from the consequences that other states might have faced. If the Zionist movement was forged by a God of faith and made real through the deity of empire, its lasting survival has been guaranteed by something even more versatile: influence. This third god of Zionism has taken many forms over time: elite connections, financial patronage, quid pro quo scientific contributions, political lobbying, and even more recently, strategic control of global narratives. From the earliest days of the movement, influence was not just a tool, it was a necessity. It began with Baron Edmond de Rothschild, the French patriarch of the powerful banking family and one of Zionism's earliest patrons. In the 1880s, he began quietly funding Jewish agricultural settlements in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. He financed over 40 colonies, schools, wineries, and industrial projects, laying the groundwork for what would later become a state. Without the support of Rothschild capital, we could not have laid the foundation stones of our home in Palestine. Another example was Chaim Weizmann, a Zionist diplomat and biochemist whose scientific achievements translated directly into political leverage. During World War I, Weizmann discovered a new method to synthesize acetone, a key ingredient in explosives. The British, desperate for a steady supply, relied on Weizmann's innovation to keep their war machine running. He, in turn, used this favor to open political doors, lobbying British officials to formal recognition of Jewish national aspirations. It worked. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued, a letter of support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But notably, it wasn't addressed to Weizmann. It was sent to Lord Walter Rothschild, the British head of the same family, and a figure deeply embedded in Britain's ruling class. The Rothschilds didn't just donate, they delivered access to ministers, to war cabinets, to empire in its entirety. This combination of finance, politics, and elite integration gave Zionism something few national movements ever achieve: imperial endorsement. And as we said earlier, after World War II, British power waned, the Cold War erupted, and Zionist influence focused towards the United States. to eventually become the global patron of Israel. Here, the strategy evolved. Jewish organizations in the United States, particularly those like the ADL or AIPAC, later on in time, built a vast and bipartisan political apparatus. Through lobbying, campaign contributions, public relation firms, think tanks, and media connections, they transformed US support for Israel into a political norm. Israel controls the United States Senate. We should be more concerned about the United States' interests. Since the 1960s, US foreign policy, including military aid now amounting to $3.8 billion annually, routine vetoes of UN resolutions, and diplomatic cover for controversial actions, is now closely aligned with Israel's strategic priorities. Criticism of Israel, no matter how grounded in fact or law, is often met with accusations of anti-Semitism, weaponized to discredit dissent. But political influence alone wasn't enough. Zionist leaders understood that to maintain power in the long term, they also had to shape public perception. And so emerged Hasbara, the Zionist state-sponsored public diplomacy and propaganda. Hasbara efforts aim to justify Israeli policies abroad, manage Israel's global image, and discredit Palestinian narratives. These efforts have built a layered defense system, not just against bombs, but against any type of criticism. They seek to reframe reality, casting Israel as the perpetual victim, even when it acts as a regional hegemon. This is the third god of Zionism, not worshipped, but wielded, the god of influence. A force that began with philanthropic colonization and elite access and evolved into a system of political control and global narrative management. It's what allows Israel today to act with astonishing impunity, expanding settlements, defying UN rulings, bombing civilians and their infrastructure, all with little consequence. Because when you can shape the story, fund the power, and silence the opposition, you don't fear international law, you lie yourself around it. So what happens when the gods grow tired? The theology is strained, even amongst Jews, by both decades of conflict and in modernity, by significant population growing in secularist liberalism. The empire is uncertain. American support, while still strong, is no longer unquestioned. And the influence, while powerful, is facing a rising scrutiny. Every people has the right to use the means at their disposal to pursue safety, dignity, and self-determination. That's not what makes Zionism unique. What makes it troubling is not its use of influence, but its goals. Goals that were forged through dispossession, inequality, and violence. When the methods of power serve an unjust cause, the result is not liberation, it's domination. Zionism, like any political movement, is not eternal. Its survival depends not only on power, but on legitimacy. Can it adapt to a world where colonial logic is no longer acceptable? Can it reconcile with the people displaced in its name? To me, I sense that the future of Zionism, and then onwards Israel, may depend on its ability to see the humanity of the Palestinian people, not just its own sense of divine mission. In the end, perhaps the most dangerous illusion is in believing in these too many gods that serve your purpose, and not believing in a power, in a God that is good and benevolent.